For about 150 years, classrooms meant blackboards. This thing was invented around 1800, either by a Scottish headmaster named James Pillans or an American teacher named George Barron. Before blackboards, teachers had to write on each student's slate individually, which was obviously a nightmare. The blackboard solved this because suddenly the teacher could write something once and everyone saw it. Early boards were actual slate stone, just dark grey rock hung on walls. Later, they used porcelain enamel on steel, which lasted decades. The chalk wasn't even real chalk, it was gypsum for coloured sticks and calcium carbonate for white. That dust got everywhere. On your hands, your clothes, in your lungs. Teachers sent kids outside to bang erasers together, white clouds exploding everywhere. The squeak was annoying, but nothing compared to fingernails scraping the board, a sound so horrible scientists studied why we hate it. By the late 1980s, schools started switching to whiteboards, and now screens have mostly taken over. Before ballpoint pens took over, British schoolchildren spent their days wrestling with pens and nibs that had to be repeatedly dipped into little white china ink pots set into holes in their desks. The ink never stayed where it was meant to, somehow always travelling up your second finger and threatening to create blots on your exercise book or clothes, which teachers hated. The nibs themselves got twisted and damaged easily, so they had to be eased out of the pen holder and replaced with fresh ones regularly. When mistakes happened, and they happened constantly, you couldn't just rub them out like pencil marks. Blotting paper soaked up wet ink, but didn't remove it once it dried. Some schools had ink erasers, which were basically lumps of rough pumice or similar abrasive material, but using them was brutal. You'd scrape away at the paper trying to remove the ink, and more often than not, you'd tear straight through, leaving a hole where your mistake used to be. The harder you rubbed, the worse it got. Most children just gave up and scratched words out instead. It was messy and frustrating. Free school milk became universal in Britain in 1946 when every child under 18 got 1/3 of a pint daily. Poor kids weren't getting enough nutrition, and that hurt their learning, so the thinking was milk would give them calcium and a boost. The milk arrived each morning in small glass bottles with foil or cardboard tops, delivered by the local milkman in crates. The problem was storage. Most schools had nowhere cool to keep it, so crates sat outside until mid-morning break. In winter, the milk froze solid, ice pushing through the tops, and in summer it turned warm and curdled. You'd poke your straw through and get tepid, slightly off milk that tasted awful. Plenty of kids hated it, and in schools where drinking was compulsory, some threw up from the warm curdled stuff. The scheme got cut back. Labour ended it for secondary pupils in 1968. Then Margaret Thatcher scrapped it for over sevens in 1971, earning the nickname Thatcher, the milk snatcher. British school dinners from the 50s through to the 80s had their own smell, and you'd catch it from down the corridor. Overcooked cabbage mainly, boiled for so long it turned into watery green mush. You sat at long tables in the hall with a dinner lady or older pupil keeping watch, and you were expected to finish everything on your plate even if it went cold. The main course was usually mince with lumpy mashed potato, liver and onions, or fish on Fridays, often white fish drowning in thick parsley sauce. Tinned peas or more cabbage on the side, all of it swimming in thin gravy. The puddings made up for everything though: spotted dick, jam roly-poly, treacle sponge, served with custard poured from a big metal jug. That custard had a skin on top, which the dinner lady would hold back with her spoon. Tapioca was there too, which every kid called frog spawn, and nobody would eat. Morning assembly was a daily fixture in British schools for decades, and in many places it still is. The routine hardly varied. Children filed into the hall and sat cross-legged on the floor in neat rows, youngest at the front, oldest at the back. Everyone had to sit up straight and keep quiet. The head teacher would announce a hymn number, often from a dog-eared hymn book that each child was issued at the start of the year. A piano would start up and you'd sing something like "All Things Bright and Beautiful" or "Morning Has Broken." After the hymn came a Bible reading, usually delivered by a teacher or sometimes a prefect in secondary schools. Then prayers, almost always Christian in nature, ending with the Lord's Prayer that everyone mumbled through by heart. Finally came the notices. Sports results, lost property, reminders not to run in the corridors, upcoming trips. The whole thing took about 15 or 20 minutes. For some kids, it was a chance to zone out before lessons started. For others, it was just another ritual to endure. One more way the school kept everyone together and under control. Step into an old school building and you'd know it just by breathing. The corridors had this particular blend, floor polish on wooden boards, thick and waxy, with a chemical edge that caught in your throat. In the cloakroom, the smell of wet wool coats would hang heavy on damp days, mixed with carbolic soap from the toilets nearby. The dining hall was its own beast. You could tell what lunch was from 3 rooms away. Overcooked cabbage dominated most days, mixing with cheap gravy and whatever mystery meat sat underneath. When they served custard, it added a sickly sweet note. Classrooms smelled of chalk dust, that fine powdery scent that drifted off the blackboard and erasers. The gym brought rubber and old sweat baked into floor mats that never dried properly. Underneath it all was Jai's fluid, or some similar disinfectant, that sharp clinical smell that meant cleanliness but not comfort. These scents have mostly vanished now, replaced by air fresheners and modern cleaning products. But anyone who went to school before the 1990s can probably conjure them instantly. If you walked into a British grammar school gym lesson in 1950 or 1960, the kit would look remarkably basic. Most boys wore white cotton shorts, thin and brief with about an inch of leg, and simple black plimsolls. That was it. The plimsolls were canvas shoes with rubber soles, dead simple in construction. You had a strip of rubber covering where the sole met the canvas upper, sometimes a rubber toe cap, and that was your lot. They cost next to nothing. Black was most common, white for proper PE. The shorts were loose and you wore nothing underneath, no underpants. In the gym, you stripped to the waist, so just shorts and plimsolls on bare feet, or barefoot if your plimsolls were too dirty. The floor might be cold coconut matting, but you adapted quickly. It felt strange at first being essentially half naked, but within weeks it became normal. Modern sportswear with technical fabrics and branded trainers is a different world. Walk into any British school gym from the 1950s through to the 1990s, and you would find the same setup. Wall bars lined at least one wall, solid wooden frames with horizontal bars stretching up to the ceiling, maybe 3 meters high. They were bolted into the wall and looked like they could survive anything. Climbing ropes hung from metal fixtures in the ceiling. Thick manila rope that left your hands raw if you tried sliding down too fast. Wooden benches, long and narrow, could be flipped onto their sides to make balance beams or angled against the wall bars for inclined climbing. Then there were the climbing frames themselves, wooden contraptions that folded out from the walls in rainbow or Y-shaped configurations. Everything was heavy, solid timber with oval bars, designed to withstand decades of children swinging, climbing, and occasionally falling off. The equipment had a faint smell of wood varnish and old sweat, sometimes mixed with the rubber from gym mats below. It all felt slightly dangerous in the best possible way. Something about that polished wood and the height made every activity feel like a proper challenge. You either got on with it or you looked soft in front of your mates. Before smartboards and computer projectors took over classrooms in the late 1990s and early 2000s, the overhead projector was the standard teaching tool for several decades. The machine itself was simple enough. A bright lamp sat inside a box beneath a glass plate, shining light upward through whatever sheet of transparent plastic you placed on top. That light bounced off a mirror positioned above and projected the image onto a screen or wall behind you. The transparent sheets were called acetates or transparencies, and teachers would write on them with special felt-tip pens in various colors. The big advantage over chalkboards was that you could face your class the entire time rather than turning your back to scribble. You could also prepare transparencies in advance and reuse them lesson after lesson, though washing the marker off never worked properly. Dried water spots and color smears always remained. The projectors themselves were heavy, bulky beige boxes that took up desk space and needed several minutes to warm up before the bulb reached full brightness. By the mid-2000s, most had been wheeled into storage cupboards and forgotten. Digital technology simply made them obsolete almost overnight. In British schools throughout the 1980s and 1990s, the arrival of the television trolley was a proper event. You would hear it first, that distinctive squeal of wheels rolling down the corridor, and the entire classroom would go quiet with anticipation. These things were built like tanks, about 4 feet tall with thick metal frames, and often a wooden cabinet section with doors. The telly itself sat up top, usually a 26-inch set in a wood effect casing, heavy enough that nobody was moving it without the trolley. Most had a shelf underneath for the video player, and there was always a power strip dangling off the side with cables that seemed magnetically attracted to getting tangled. When the teacher wheeled it through the door, kids would shift in their seats trying to get a good viewing angle without being too obvious about it. The lights would go down, someone would fiddle with the tracking on the VCR, and for the next half hour you were watching something educational but infinitely better than a textbook. The tape recorder became standard kit in language classrooms from the 1950s onwards. If you were learning French or German in the 70s or 80s, you probably spent time in a language laboratory, rows of booths fitted with headphones, a microphone on a boom arm, and a cassette deck behind a protective panel. The teacher would record a master program onto your machine at high speed. Then you'd press record and listen to a native speaker reading phrases. During the pauses, you'd repeat the words into your microphone, recording yourself over the blank spaces. This was called an audio-active comparative system. You could rewind and compare your accent to the original. The open reel machines of the early days were complicated beasts with multiple motors and rubber belts that perished constantly. By the 80s, cassettes made things simpler, though breakdowns remained common. Teachers also used portable recorders for sound effects in English lessons, seagull cries to inspire creative writing about the coast, that sort of thing. The tape shaped how millions learned to speak and listen in a foreign tongue. Teachers in older British schools from around the 1860s through to the mid-20th century ran their classrooms with absolute authority, and there was no such thing as questioning them. Most were unmarried women called Miss Stern, and by modern standards, genuinely frightening. They earned poor wages and often learnt the job through apprenticeship rather than college training, but that did not diminish their power. A typical classroom might hold 30 to 50 pupils, sometimes more, all seated in rows at iron desks, bolted to the floor. To control these large classes, teachers relied on fear and repetition. Lessons meant copying from the blackboard, chanting times tables until perfect, and sitting bolt upright without moving. Any talking, fidgeting, poor work, or rudeness earned immediate punishment, usually the cane across your hand or backside. Some teachers kept a punishment book logging every offense. Left-handed children were forced to use their right hand. Slow learners wore a dunce hat and stood in the corner facing the wall, sometimes on a stool, whilst everyone watched. The teacher's word was law, and children knew that complaining to parents would likely earn a second punishment at home. Lines were everything in the old schools. You formed them in the playground when the bell rang, stood silently waiting for permission to enter, then moved through the building in orderly formation. No talking, no shuffling, no looking sideways at your mates. The idea was simple enough. Hundreds of children moving between classrooms needed managing, or you'd have chaos in narrow corridors. Schools enforced this with detentions, demerits, and public tellings off. Some head teachers drew actual lines down the middle of hallways to keep traffic flowing smoothly. You walked on your side, eyes forward, mouths shut. If you spoke to someone passing the other way, you'd be pulled up for it straight away. The silence rule extended to staircases, cloakrooms, even the way you entered assembly. Teachers positioned themselves at intervals to monitor compliance, catching anyone who stepped out of line or whispered to a friend. It was regimented, certainly, but that was the point. Order above all else. You learned quickly that school had its own peculiar rules that bore little resemblance to ordinary life, and you followed them without question because that's simply how things were done. Detention in mid-20th century schools was genuinely intimidating, and it worked precisely because of that. If you misbehaved, you stayed behind after school, sitting in silence at a desk whilst a teacher watched over you. Sometimes you wrote lines, copying out the same sentence hundreds of times until your hand cramped. I must not talk in class. I must not run in corridors over and over. The real punishment was losing your free time and the shame that came with it. Missing playtime was another common consequence, especially in primary schools. You stood against a wall watching your classmates play whilst you reflected on whatever you'd done wrong. Then there were the public scoldings, which could be brutal. Some girls were called onto the stage during assembly, named in front of the entire school for accumulating too many detentions. That kind of public humiliation was deliberately designed to embarrass you, to make an example. Teachers used stern voices and disappointed looks that cut deeper than you'd expect. The whole system relied on fear and shame rather than understanding, and it felt intimidating because it was meant to. Every schoolchild had at least 2 exercise books for each subject, and keeping them properly was serious business. Your rough book was where you practiced and worked things out, usually in pencil. This one stayed with you and rarely got handed in unless the teacher suspected you hadn't done your work. Then came your neat book, sometimes called your best book, which was entirely different. Everything here had to be written in ink with your fountain pen, laid out correctly, and kept absolutely spotless, because this was what got collected and marked. One smudge or ink blob on the page meant real trouble. The phrase, "blot your copybook," comes from exactly this, when one careless stain could ruin a whole page of careful work. Teachers marked everything in red ink, and those corrections stood out harsh against the page. Handwriting mattered more than you might think, often counting for more than spelling or even the right answers. You wrote your name, form, and subject on the cover in your best script, and the teacher expected that standard throughout. If you went to primary school in Britain or America before the 1970s, you probably learned from one of a handful of iconic reading schemes that shaped entire generations. In America, the McGuffey readers dominated from the 1830s through to the early 20th century, selling around 120 million copies. These graded primers used moral stories and repetition to drill words through phonics. Then came Dick and Jane in the 1930s from Scott Forsman, taking a different approach called the whole word method, where children recognized entire words by sight rather than sounding them out. Endless repetition of phrases like "see Spot run" and cheerful illustrations of middle-class suburban children helped drill the words in. The books dominated American classrooms for decades. By the 1960s, critics turned on them, complaining about limited vocabulary, racial exclusion, and mind-numbing simplicity. Phonics advocates argued children weren't learning to decode words, just memorizing them. Dick and Jane were retired in 1965, replaced by more diverse readers, but for millions, those repetitive books were their first encounter with reading.